In this lesson, I want to introduce you to another matcher, another type of assertion that we can make, in this case, for equality, and it is the toEqual matcher. So far, we've been using the toBe matcher. That's what we have, for example, on lines 4 and 8. toEqual also checks for equality, but it is intended for use with objects, including things like arrays. So let's first run into a problem, and then we'll see how the toEqual matcher helps us solve it. So at the end of the previous lesson, we created this extra describe block for testing arrays, and we said we had a test here for adding an element to the end of an array. So here's a simple test. What we can do is declare an array, then use the push method to add an element to the end of that array, and then validate that the new array has that added element at the end, right? So once again, we're testing basic JavaScript functionality here, but the key takeaway is really just syntax and its internal mechanics. So super simple test here. Inside my function body, I'll declare an array called numbers, and I'll just populate it with a bunch of arbitrary values like 1, 2, 3. On the next line, I'm going to take my numbers array, and I'm going to call the push method on it, and I'm going to pass in a value of 4. Remember, we are totally welcome to modify the numbers array, even though we're using const right here, because this const simply refers to the array that the numbers constant is referencing. We are still able to mutate that exact array that constant is referencing. That's just basic JavaScript. But at the end of this operation, we should have an array with 4 numbers. So you might think our test would look like this. Expect numbers, and we can say toBe, and pass in the array that we expect to have, which is an array of 1, 2, 3, and 4. We're going to discover that this is actually going to be a failing test. And if I scroll up, we can see we're going to say, if it should pass with deep equality, replace toBe with toStrictEqual. But as I scroll down, you can see we're not actually getting a passing test. And you might be curious about what all this means. So what the toBe matcher actually does is it compares with strict equality, which also compares with identity. What identity means is that it's the same object in JavaScript memory. So whenever we're using something like primitives in JavaScript, and by that I mean strings or numbers or booleans, JavaScript doesn't actually create different copies in memory of that same value. That's in contrast to arrays. So here's what happened here. When we pushed on a value onto the numbers array on line 15, we indeed modified this array. This array of 4 values now exists somewhere in the computer's memory. But this thing right here is a totally separate array in the computer's memory. We basically declared a new array inline consisting of exactly 4 values, 1, 2, 3, 4, and JavaScript found somewhere else on the computer to store that new array. So basically, the numbers array and this array right here in our toBe argument, they are equal in the kind of human sense. They are both arrays of 4 elements, and those 4 elements are the same, but they are not the same array in the computer's memory. They exist in different locations. So they are not the same data structure. They are not the same entity. They're not identical. That's what the word identity means when you're talking about equality. It means that 2 objects are actually the same object in the computer's memory. We basically are comparing our original array with a clone or a copy or our own separate independent created array, and the test is saying, well, those are 2 separate arrays. They're not actually the same array. I know that they're equal, but they're not literally the same array in memory. So you can see the toBe matcher is not going to work, and Jest is going to tell us that it serializes to the same string. Basically, what Jest is telling us is, hey, if you were to convert these arrays to string representations, the strings are the same. So something is equal here, but I can't get this test to pass yet because you're asking me to check for the thing being the exact same identity, literally the same object in memory. So in order to do this, what we can do is replace toBe with toEqual. And what toEqual is going to do is perform the kind of assertion that we care about. Not so much about the array being the exact same array in memory, but being equal from the sense that we care about, having the same length, having the same elements in the exact same order. So you'll notice when I save this, the tests now pass. And for example, if I add on an extra element to this array, now the test will fail as expected, and you can see it's going to say, actually, the array you told me to expect has the additional value 5, but the one that I received actually only has the original elements of 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're starting to see some additional output regarding how Jest is going to tell us about things like mismatching elements or additional elements or missing elements. So we kind of only covered the basics as far as looking at numeric equality, but when it comes to things like arrays and objects, Jest is going to try to be helpful in telling us where the mismatch is between what we're getting from our execution logic versus what we are asserting, right? So in this case, it's saying, hey, you told me an array of 4 numbers, and here you told me an array of 5 numbers. I'm getting something totally different, so I'm going to give you a failing test. And that, of course, is our inspiration to dive into the code and figure out what's going wrong. Keep in mind, sometimes the error may be in our implementation, and sometimes the error may be in our test, in our assertion. We might have written it incorrectly like we did here. In this case, the problem is that we really don't need a 5 right here, but it can go in either direction. Another thing I want to show you just before we close this lesson off is what we have here on lines 14 through 16 is a lot more of a typical test setup, and it follows that arrange, act, assert pattern that we talked about a couple lessons ago, kind of the structure of how a test is laid out in terms of phases and steps. So here is where we have the arrange part. We are creating the data and the objects that we're going to need for the test. Then the next line is the actual acting. This is us doing something, performing something, some kind of event, some kind of action, some kind of method in this case, right? And then the final line is the actual assert part of arrange, act, assert. That's where we're actually doing the assertion, the validation, the thing that we're checking to be true, right? Sometimes if the test gets more complex and the arrange, act, and assert parts have a little bit more logic and a little bit more lines to them, what you might see some developers do is create a line break between the different phases, just so there's this visual communication of the arrange part, the act part, and then the assert part. Kind of like the setup, then the action, then the validation. All right. Now, in this case, since the test is pretty small, I don't think the blank lines actually help. So I'm just going to remove them and get back to our original design. But that's just something important to know when you're looking to explore other people's tests. They're trying to communicate often that they are kind of splitting up the arrange part, the act, and assert part whenever you see line breaks in people's tests. All right, so now we know a little bit more about the toEqual matcher. We use it whenever we want to do equality, but between non-primitive values in JavaScript. So you can think about things like arrays or objects, right? Things that are more complex than JavaScript's primitive values like strings, numbers, and booleans. Because again, by default, the to-be expectation is going to check for identity. It's going to check for literal equality, that the thing is the exact same object in the computer's memory. And while that rule applies to things like numbers and strings in JavaScript, it doesn't apply to arrays. So if we declare an array in line like so, that array is going to be a different array in memory from the one we created and modified on these 2 lines, and thus to-be will not work. But toEqual will, because toEqual will check for actual equality in the sense of the same object for the purposes of use in our program. Not literally the same object, but the same object as far as same data structure, same length, same elements in order, etc. That's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I will see you in the next one.